Welcome back for another deep dive with us. Today we're going to be taking a look at Amazon. And not just the Amazon that you see, like making headlines every day, but the core principles that kind of took them from, that online bookstore to, well, everything they are today.
It's funny because when you think about Amazon, their success story isn't about some like flash of brilliance, right? Like it wasn't one idea that took them to the top.
Yeah.
It was about a very, very deliberate approach to innovation.
Okay, so to help us unpack all of that, we've got a couple of really interesting sources for you today. So first up, we're looking at Andy Jassy's 2021 letter to shareholders, and it was his first as CEO, so that makes it extra interesting to dive into.
Yeah.
And then to kind of help us make sense of everything and hit those key points, we've got a list of discussion questions that someone put together about that letter.
Yeah, these are great because they really pull out those big themes
Right.
that we're going to be kind of looking at today.
Yeah, yeah.
So think of this as like a crash course in how Amazon thinks strategically. So whether you're, prepping for a big meeting about corporate strategy or just curious about how companies kind of grow and evolve, we're going to uncover some insights that you just don't find in your typical business article.
I like that.
Yeah.
Okay, so Jassy kind of kicks things off with this idea of iterative innovation. And honestly, I think this is a concept that a lot of people misunderstand.
Yeah, it's really the idea that Amazon isn't obsessed with being first.
Yeah.
They're really in it for the long game, right? Like they're aiming to be the best, but in
Yeah.
the long run, and they get there by just constantly refining and improving.
So it's not about launching like the perfect product right out of the gate. It's about getting something good out there and then making it great over time.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah, and Jassy gives some really compelling examples to kind of illustrate this point. And I think a really good one is their massive fulfillment network. I mean, imagine like back in the early 2000s, it took something like 18 hours to get an item through one of their fulfillment centers.
Yeah, it seems almost like
That-
unimaginable now, right? Like
Yeah.
they've got it down to 2 hours today, but that's the result of years of relentlessly optimizing things, like strategic investment, that commitment to constant improvement.
And you can't underestimate like how important that was during the pandemic. I mean, when the world went into lockdown and demand for online shopping just skyrocketed, they were able to handle it in a way that I don't think would have been possible without those like 2 decades of groundwork.
Absolutely, and that commitment to iterative innovation is kind of woven into so many of their success stories.
Like AWS, their cloud computing arm. It's hard to imagine now, but when they first launched their core service, EC2,
Yeah.
it was intentionally feature poor.
Yeah, I mean,
Can you imagine?
yeah, this is where it gets like really interesting because so many businesses they want to launch with this like fully loaded bells and whistles product, but Amazon was like completely different. They wanted to get that core service out there fast. It didn't have to be perfect, right? They were just focused on like speed, and then they relied heavily on customer feedback to actually shape how it evolved.
So it was kind of a calculated risk, right? They were betting that speed and being able to adapt quickly was more valuable in the long run than trying to launch with some flawless product that might not even meet customer needs.
Exactly, and it paid off in a big way, right? I mean, AWS is now the dominant player in cloud computing, and that feature poor launch, it was actually like crucial to their journey.
Yeah, it's a good reminder that sometimes the most innovative move is to kind of let go of the need for perfection and just embrace that power of being able to iterate quickly.
Yeah, and you see that same principle at play with, like the Kindle. Do you remember that first generation Kindle? Let's just say the design left a lot to be desired.
Yeah, it wasn't winning any beauty contests, that's for sure.
Right.
But I mean, that core functionality, that ability to download, like any book in seconds, I mean, that was revolutionary.
It was. And that willingness to prioritize that functionality over, how it looked initially was a pretty calculated risk.
Yeah.
And did allow them to get the product into people's hands quickly and then gather that feedback, for future iterations. And not every company can take that gamble,
Right. Well,
especially when you're first starting out.
but for Amazon, it was a part of a larger strategy, right?
Totally.
And it's a strategy that we see, evident in the evolution of Prime Video as well.
Right. From those early days of downloadable videos with Amazon Unboxed to streaming,
Mhm.
then to original content. And now they've got the NFL's Thursday Night Football.
Yeah, that's a big one.
Right. Like it really shows how they're able to adapt, and their long-term vision.
Right, right.
Like they're not just thinking about today, they're thinking about 5-10 years down the road. And that NFL deal, that's a massive investment in the future where streaming like dominates.
Yeah, so they're clearly doing something right, right?
Yeah.
And to give us a little bit of a framework for understanding how they kind of pull all of this off, Jassy lays out 7 key components for successful iterative innovation.
And what's amazing about these components is that they're not just relevant to tech giants.
Right, yeah.
These are principles that any business or project can use,
Yeah.
regardless of the size or the industry.
Yeah, I mean, that's huge.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's dive into those. So first up, he talks about hiring builders and not just managers.
Yeah, people who are like passionate about creating and improving.
Right. Yeah. So it's not enough to just have people who can manage processes. You need those people that are driven to build and innovate. I mean, that's the foundation of their culture.
Totally. And then you've got to organize those builders into like small autonomous teams and give them that freedom to move fast,
Yeah.
to make decisions without layers of bureaucracy.
Right. So empower them to be agile
Exactly.
and responsive.
And that ties into the next component, which is giving those teams, not just the tools, but the permission, right, to actually move quickly.
Yeah.
This isn't a top-down, like, command and control environment. They really trust their team.
To make the right calls.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. And that requires like a certain level of faith from the leadership too, right? You have to have that belief in the long-term vision, but no false hope. You got to be realistic about what's actually achievable.
Yeah, it's about balancing that vision with like a clear-eyed assessment of what's
Right.
actually possible. And that kind of leads into this next principle, which is all about the product itself. So, Jassy talks about launching a minimum lovable product and then just iterating rapidly.
So it's not just a minimum viable product. It's got to be something that people like actually love.
Right from the get-go.
But then you have to be willing to constantly iterate based on, the feedback, making it better over time.
And that's where the magic happens, right? It's not about launching with perfection. It's about launching with something good and like making it great through a series of, small incremental improvements.
Right. And Amazon doesn't give up easily. Like they have this long-term orientation. They don't abandon projects prematurely, which is pretty refreshing in a world where so many companies are just so quick to pull the plug on anything that doesn't show immediate results.
Yeah, it speaks to their like willingness to stick with an idea,
Right.
to nurture it and give it the time it needs to kind of blossom, even if it takes years.
Yeah. Yeah. And then finally, they embrace failure as like a part of the process.
You can't innovate without taking some risks, and sometimes those risks they just don't pay off.
But you learn from them.
Exactly, those failures, they're valuable.
Right.
They provide lessons. They force you to kind of reevaluate your assumptions, and they can ultimately lead to better outcomes.
Yeah. And this whole long-term mindset, it goes like way back to Amazon's like roots.
Okay.
Even in their 1997 shareholder letter, there's this incredible quote and it says, "When forced to choose between optimizing the appearance of our GAAP accounting and maximizing the present value of future cash flows, we'll take the cash flows."
Now, for those who might not be familiar with GAAP, it stands for Generally Accepted Accounting Principles, and it's essentially like the standard set of rules for financial reporting.
Right.
But what's so remarkable about that statement is that even back then,
Yeah.
Amazon was like signaling their willingness to prioritize that long-term value creation over, short-term profits.
So they were basically saying like, we're not playing the short game.
We're building something for the long haul.
Yeah, which is, I mean, that's a pretty radical concept, especially in the business world where, so many companies are obsessed with like quarterly earnings.
It's a different mindset, for
Yeah,
sure.
yeah.
And it's that mindset that's allowed them to make investments that might like seem crazy in the short term, but they end up like paying off hugely in the long run.
Like building that massive fulfillment network that we talked about, or pouring billions of dollars into projects like Kuiper, their satellite internet constellation.
Yeah, I mean, they're bets on the future.
Yeah,
And they might not always pan out,
right.
but the ones that do, like, they yield just incredible returns.
Right. And it's that long-term thinking that really sets them apart.
It's a breath of fresh air, honestly, in a world where like so many companies were just focused on the next quarter, the next earnings report.
Yeah, yeah. It's a good reminder that sometimes the best way to achieve success is to focus on building something truly great, even if it takes a little longer. Okay, so we've got like a pretty good understanding now of how iterative innovation works in practice, and the core principles that kind of drive it.
Yeah.
But I think we should dig a little bit deeper into those 7 key components that Jassy outlined.
Yeah, because, while the concepts themselves are pretty straightforward,
Right.
the way that Amazon actually like puts them into practice, I think that's where it gets like really fascinating.
Right. Yeah, there's some interesting stuff there.
So,
Let's take a closer look.
all right, let's do it. So you were talking about hiring builders. How do they actually foster that mentality throughout the company?
Well, one way is by giving their employees, even at like the lower levels, a surprising amount of autonomy. For instance, remember how we were just talking about AWS and launching EC2 without that persistent storage feature?
Right. It seemed almost counterintuitive.
Exactly. But get this. The decision to actually launch that way wasn't made by like some big executive committee.
Wow.
It was hammered out in a 3-hour meeting
Right.
by the engineers who were actually building the service.
Wow, that's pretty remarkable.
I know, right?
So they're really empowering their teams to make those tough calls, the ones that could like make or break a product.
Yeah, it seems that way. And I wonder if that level of trust is kind of what allows them to move so fast and, experiment and iterate without getting like bogged down in bureaucracy.
It's a fascinating example of how they actually put that builder mentality
Yeah.
into practice.
Yeah.
And it makes you wonder like how many other companies would benefit from a similar approach. It's clearly not about micromanaging. It's about, giving talented people the space and the freedom to really innovate.
And that ties directly into that idea of organizing into those small autonomous teams, right?
Mm.
Another one of Jassy's key components.
Absolutely, yeah. It's like they're saying, "Hey, we trust you to make the best decisions for the customer," which at the end of the day, that's what benefits everyone.
Right. Speaking of customers, we can't talk about Amazon without talking about their like almost obsessive focus on the customer experience.
Right. It's not just a slogan for them. It really seems to like permeate everything they do.
Yeah.
It's evident in everything from their relentless drive to improve delivery speeds to the focus on user experience in their devices, even their decision to build their own chipsets for AWS. It's about like delivering the best possible experience for their cloud customers.
And let's not forget about their willingness to like invest in these seemingly crazy projects like Kuiper, their satellite internet constellation.
Exactly. They see an underserved market, people without reliable internet access,
Yeah.
and they're willing to make a huge bet on a solution that could have a transformative impact on those communities.
It might not be immediately profitable, but if they can deliver on that promise, I mean, the long-term gains could be enormous, right?
Right. Absolutely.
And it all goes back to that long-term vision and that customer-centric approach.
It's a fascinating case study in how a company can leverage its resources to not just like chase profits,
Right.
but to genuinely make a difference in the world.
Yeah.
It's not just about selling more stuff. It's about using their platform and their technology to address like real world problems.
Yeah. And it's not just about big, splashy projects either. I mean, Amazon is constantly iterating on even the smallest details, like, the placement of products in their warehouses, or even like the design of their shopping cart buttons.
It's that attention to detail, right? That constant striving for improvement that's allowed them to become so dominant in so many different markets.
Yeah, yeah.
They're not content to just like rest on their laurels. They're always looking for ways to get better.
Okay, but let's be real for a moment.
Yeah.
Amazon isn't perfect. They've faced, a lot of criticism over the years, particularly when it comes to like employee relations and working conditions. Does Jassy address any of that in his letter?
He does touch on it. He talks about how they've increased wages and improved benefits, and they're actively working to address employee like pain points.
So he's acknowledging that there have been some issues.
Yeah, he's not shying away from the fact that they have room for improvement, especially when it comes to like safety in their fulfillment centers.
And I think it's interesting that he acknowledges that their injury rates, while they're comparable to like industry averages, they're not where they want them to be.
Right.
He actually emphasizes that they're committed to becoming like best in class when it comes to worker safety.
Now, while acknowledging the issue is a start, some critics would argue that their actions just haven't been like sufficient to address those systemic problems. And it raises questions about whether a company that's so focused on relentless innovation can truly prioritize employee well-being alongside, profit and growth.
It's a complex issue for sure.
Yeah, it is.
But I find it refreshing to hear a CEO kind of admit that they don't have all the answers, that they're still learning and trying to do better.
It does speak to a certain level of humility,
Mm.
which frankly, you don't always see at that level.
Yeah.
And it also aligns with that core principle of iterative innovation, right?
Mm.
They're not claiming to be perfect, but they are committed to that constant learning and improvement.
It's like that day one mentality that Bezos was always talking about.
Right.
They're always looking ahead, always seeking to be better, even when they're already like leading the pack.
Yeah. Which brings us to an important question,
Okay.
If Amazon is always evolving, always iterating, like what does that tell us about the future? Not just for the company itself, but for any industry where this kind of thinking takes hold.
That's where things get really exciting. If
Uh-huh.
Amazon is like a glimpse into the future of innovation, it means we're all in for a wild ride. Buckle up. So we're talking about the future of innovation and maybe using Amazon as a potential model. What are we really looking at here?
Well, I mean, think about industries that were once considered like so stable and predictable, almost unshakable, like they were just always going to be there.
Right.
Now they're facing all this disruption from companies who've adopted this iterative, customer-centric approach that Amazon has, like, pretty much perfected.
It's like what we're seeing with Prime Video and how it's shaking up that traditional entertainment industry, right? It's not just about cable companies anymore.
Yeah, they're competing with like studios, networks, even sports leagues now.
Yeah, yeah.
It's a whole different ballgame.
It's crazy, and it's not just entertainment. I
Yeah.
mean, look at Amazon Care and healthcare, grocery delivery, even space exploration with Blue Origin. Like, they're all over the place.
It really seems like those lines between industries are blurring as companies like Amazon leverage, their tech, their data, and that intense customer focus
Hmm.
to move into these new territories.
Right.
It's almost like they're constantly asking, what's next?
Okay, but let's bring this down to earth a bit.
Yeah.
What does this all mean for the average person? Someone who's maybe not a CEO or a tech entrepreneur. What can they learn from Amazon's playbook?
I think the big takeaway here is that, these principles, the iterative innovation, the customer obsession, the long-term thinking, they're not just for big companies.
Right.
Like we can all apply them to our own work and our lives.
So it's not just about admiring Amazon from afar. It's about taking these lessons and actually using them.
Right.
I like that.
Like, for example, remember that minimum lovable product concept?
Yeah.
Could you apply that to a project at work, a new skill you're learning, even a personal goal you're trying to achieve?
Yeah,
It's a really powerful framework.
it is. It's about starting small, focusing on delivering something that people really connect with, and then constantly refining it based on the feedback and your experience, right?
Yeah, you don't have to have all the answers up front. You just have to be willing to learn and adapt as you go.
Right, exactly. And what about that long-term orientation that Amazon is known for? I mean, it's so easy to get caught up in the day-to-day grind, but what if we all kind of adopted that more long-term perspective? What could we achieve if we really focused on building something truly meaningful, even if it, takes a little bit of time and effort?
It's definitely a shift in mindset.
It is.
It's about playing that long game, being patient, and trusting the process.
Right, right. And it's important to remember that even Amazon's success isn't like guaranteed, right? This
Right.
iterative approach also means they're vulnerable to disruption themselves. I mean, who knows what new competitor or technology might come along and challenge their dominance.
It definitely keeps things interesting, right?
Yeah.
I mean, even the most successful companies, they can't afford to get complacent.
Right.
They have to constantly adapt and evolve or risk being left behind.
Absolutely. So for our listener out there, here's your challenge. What's one principle from Amazon's playbook that you can apply to your own work or your life?
Yeah, maybe it's embracing that builder mentality or focusing on long-term value creation.
Whatever it is, write it down, put it into action, and see where it takes you. The future belongs to those who are willing to constantly learn, adapt, and yes, iterate.
And on that note, I think we'll wrap up this deep dive.
Yeah.
Keep exploring, keep learning, and keep pushing the boundaries of what's possible.
Until next time.